Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. So here I have started reading this the Routledge History of Literature in English, Britain and Ireland. You can buy this book. This book is really helpful for people who are preparing for NET and JRF. So what I'll be doing here is that I'll just read this and you can just listen it like an audiobook, and I'm not going to explain the lines. It is just for your listening, so you can underline the important lines which I have underlined in my book, and you can follow this book for your preparation of UGC NET and JRF. Okay, so let us start with the Renaissance. Contexts and conditions. At the end of the 1400s, the world changed. Two key dates can mark the beginning of modern times. In 1485, the Wars of the Roses came to an end, and following the invention of printing, William Caxton issued the first imaginative book to be published in English, that is, Sir Thomas Malory's retelling of the Arthurian legends as Les Morte d'Arthur. In 1492, Christopher Columbus's voyage to the Americas opened European eyes to the existence of the New World. New worlds, both geographical and spiritual, are the key to the Renaissance, the rebirth of learning and culture, which reached its peak in Italy in the early 16th century and in Britain during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I from 1558 to 1603. England emerged from the Wars of the Roses with a new dynasty in power, the Tudors. As with all powerful leaders, the question of succession became crucial to the continuation of power. Like Beowulf with Wiglaf, like Shakespeare's Henry IV and his son Prince Hal, later Henry V. So it was with the greatest of the Tudor monarchs, Henry VIII, whose reign lasted from 1509 to 1547. In his continued attempts to father a son and heir to the line, Henry married 6 times. But his 6 wives gave him only one son and 2 daughters, who became King Edward VI, Queen Mary I, and Queen Elizabeth I. The need for the annulment of his first marriage to Catherine of Aragon brought Henry into direct conflict with the Catholic Church and with Pope Clement VII in particular. In reaction to the Catholic Church's rulings, Henry took a decisive step, which was to influence every aspect of English, then British, life and culture from that time onwards. He ended the rule of the Catholic Church in England, closed and largely destroyed the monasteries, which had for centuries been the respiratory of learning, history, and culture, and established himself as both the head of the church and head of state. The importance of this move, known as the Reformation, is huge. In a very short period of time, centuries of religious faith, attitudes, and beliefs were replaced by a new way of thinking. Now, for example, the king, as defender of the faith, was the closest human being to God, a role previously given to the Pope in Rome. Now, England became Protestant, and the nation's political and religious identity had to be refined. Protestantism, which had originated with Martin Luther's 95 Theses in Wittenberg in 1517, became the official national religion, and the king rather than the pope became head of the church. Although King Henry himself remained nominally Catholic, despite being excommunicated by the pope, all the Catholic tenets from confession to heaven and hell were questioned. It was quite simply the most radical revolution in beliefs ever to affect the nation. The closest equivalent shock to the nation's religious and moral identity is Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species, 1859, whose theories undermined the religious and biblical beliefs of Victorian society and led to a colossal crisis of identity and faith. The Reformation in the reign of Henry VIII provoked a similarly overwhelming crisis in England in the 16th century. England's identity began to be separate and distinct from Europe. The nation was to affirm its individuality historically in two ways: in the conquest of empire and in the domination of the seas. Achieved during the reign of Henry's daughter Elizabeth I. Henry VIII's break with Rome was not carried out as an isolated rebellion. Two European thinkers in particular established the climate which made it possible. The first of these was the Dutch scholar Erasmus, whose enthusiasm for classical literature was a major source of the revival in classical learnings. His contempt for the narrowness of Catholic monasticism, expressed in the praises of folly, was not an attempt to deny the authority of Pope but a challenge to the corruption of the Catholic Church. Erasmus had no time for unnecessary ritual, the sale of pardons and religious relics. He wished to return to the values of the early Christian Church, and in order to do so produced a Greek edition of the scriptures in place of the existing Latin one. Through his visits to England, Erasmus became a friend of Sir Thomas More, who was later beheaded for refusing to support Henry VIII's divorce from Catherine of Aragon. Although much of Erasmus' works prepared the ground of the Protestant reforms, his aim was to purify and remodel the Catholic Church, not to break away from it. He represented the voice of learning and knowledge, of liberal culture and tolerance. It was quite different temperament, the German Martin Luther's, which marked the decisive break with Rome. Luther agreed with much of what Erasmus said about the corruption of the Catholic Church, but they disagreed on their responses, and Luther refused to submit to the Pope's authority. Many historians regard 1517, when Luther pinned to a chapel door his 95 theses against the sale of papal indulgences, as the start of the Reformation and the birth of Protestantism. Luther's continuing opposition to the Pope led to his excommunication and the further spread of religious individualism in Northern Europe. It is against this background that we should place Henry VIII's adoption of the role of the head of the English Church and the Church's own quite separate style of Anglicanism. Luther's mission in developing the Church outside Catholicism was taken up by the Frenchman Jean Calvin. Like Luther, Calvin saw the Bible as the literal word of God and the very foundation of his ideas. For the last 20 years of Calvin's life, Geneva became the powerhouse of Protestantism. It functioned as a model of civic organization and behavior and included a much stricter morality. For example, dress was austere, patriarchy took a stronger grip, drama was censored, women were drowned, and men beheaded for adultery. This was significant because the ideas developed in Geneva spread to regions of northern Europe, including Scotland and the conformist tradition in England and Wales. This influential movement culminated a century later in the triumph of Cromwell's Puritan Commonwealth. After the Reformation, the relationship between man and God, and subsequently the place of man in the world, had to be re-examined. This was a world which was expanding. In 1492, Christopher Columbus traveled in search of the Indies, landing first in the Caribbean island of Hispaniola. For many years, he was credited with having discovered the Americas. Over the next century or so, Copernicus and Galileo would establish scientifically that the Earth was not the center of the universe. This expansion was reflected in the mental explorations of the time. The figure of the Dutch philosopher Erasmus also takes an considerable importance here. His humanist thinking had a great influence on generations of writers whose work placed men at the center of the universe. It was not by accident that Neoplatonic philosophy from the great age of classical Greece became dominant in the Renaissance. It deals of the harmony of the universe and the perfectibility of mankind, formulated before the birth of Christianity, opened up the humanist ways of thinking that pervaded much European and English Renaissance writing. Literature before the Renaissance had frequently offered ideal patterns. Literature before the Renaissance had frequently offered ideal patterns for living which were dominated by the ethos of the church. But after the Reformation, the search for individual expression and meaning took over. Institutions were questioned and re evaluated, often while being praised at the same time. But where there had been conventional modes of expression reflecting ideal modes of behavior, religious, heroic, or social, Renaissance writing explored the geography of the human soul, redefining its relationship with authority, history, science, and the future. This involved experimentation with form and genre, and an enormous variety of linguistic and literary innovations in a short period of time. Reason rather than religion was the driving force in this search for rules to govern human behavior in the Renaissance world. The power and mystique of religion had been overthrown in the bold stroke where the marvelous no longer holds sway. Real life has to provide explanations man and the use he makes of his powers, capabilities, and free will in thus the subject matter of Renaissance literature, from the early sonnets modelled on Petrarch to the English epic which loses the period Paradise Lost, published after the Restoration when the Renaissance had long finished. The Reformation gave cultural, philosophical, and ideological impetus to English Renaissance writing. The writers in the century following the Reformation had to explore and redefine all the corners of humanity in a world where old assumptions were no longer valid, where scientific discoveries questioned age old hypotheses, and where man rather than God was the central interest. It was the writers who reflected and attempted to respond to the disintegration of former certainties. For it is when the universe is out of control that it is at its most frightening and its most stimulating. There would never again be such an atmosphere of creative tension in the country. What was created was a language, a literature, and a national international identity. At the same time, there occurred the growth, some historians would say, the birth of modern science, mathematics, and astronomy. In the fourth decade of the 16th century, Copernicus replaced Aristotle's system with the sun rather than the earth at the center of the universe. In anatomy, Harvey discovered 1628 the circulation of blood, building on 16th century work in Italy. There was a similar explosion from the start of the 17th century in the discovery, development, and use of clocks, telescopes, thermometers, compasses, microscopes, all instruments designed to measure and investigate more closely to the visible and invisible world. The writing of the era was the most extensive exploration of human freedom since the classical period. This led English literature to a new religious, social, and moral identity which it maintained until the mid 19th century. English became one of the richest and most varied of world literatures and is still the object of interest and study in places and times distant from its origin. The Reformation and the century of cultural adjustment and conflict which followed are crucial keys in the understanding of English literature's many identities. The literature of the English Renaissance contains some of the greatest names in all world literature: Shakespeare, Marlowe, Webster, and Johnson among the dramatists, Sidney Spencer, Donne, and Milton among the poets, Bacon, Nash, Raleigh, Brown, and Hooker in prose, and at the center of them all, the authorized version of Bible published in 1611 by King James. So many great names and texts are involved. So many questions were under debate. What is man? What is life for? Why is life so short? What is good and bad? And who is to judge? What is a king? What is love? Questions like this. There are questions which have been the stuff of literature and of philosophy since the beginning of time, but they were never too actively and thoroughly made a part of everyday discussion as in the Elizabethan and Jacobean ages. Politically, it was an unsettled time. Although Elizabeth reigned for some 45 years, there are constant threats, plots, and potential rebellions against her. Protestant extremists, Puritans were a constant presence. Many people left the country for religious reasons in order to set up the first colonies in Virginia and Pennsylvania, the beginnings of another new world. Catholic dissent, the Counter Reformation, reached its most noted expression in Guy Fawkes' Gunpowder Plot of November 1605. Still remembered on that day every year, and Elizabeth's one time favourite, the Earl of Essex, led a plot against his monarch which considerably unsettled the political climate of the end of the century. Elizabeth's reign did, however, give the nation some sense of stability and a considerable sense of national and religious triumph when, in 1588, the Spanish Armada, the fleet of the Catholic King Philip of Spain, was defeated. England had sovereignty over the seas, and her seamen plundered the gold of the Spanish Empire to make their own queen the richest and most powerful monarch in the world. With the growth in the wealth and political importance of the nation, London developed in size and importance as the nation's capital. The increasing population could not normally read or write but did go to the theatre. Hence, from the foundation of the first public theatre in 1576, the stage became the forum for debate, spectacle, and entertainment. It was the place where the writer took his work to an audience which might include the Queen herself and the lowliest of her subjects. Hand in hand with the growth in theatrical expression goes to growth of modern English as a national language. So I'll end my video here. This is the first part of not first part, this is the first unit, we can say, of the Renaissance, that was context and conditions. In my next video we are going to start Renaissance poetry. See you in my next video. Till then, keep reading, and please do underline the important points that I have marked in my book, so it will be helpful in your exams. And if you like the video, I'm sorry that I don't explain. I just read it for my sake and for your sake, so that you can hear this as an audio book. So if you like the video, please like, share, and subscribe. Thank you.